Please help me to reach 7,000 subscribers. Rain hammered against the cracked window pane as the woman stood frozen behind the counter, her trembling hands clutching a shattered glass. The sound of laughter echoed from the corner booth. Not joyful laughter, but the cruel kind that cuts deep. You really think people like you deserve a job like this? The man sneered, flicking a coin toward her feet. The coin rolled across the wet floor and stopped near her torn shoes. She blinked hard, fighting back tears that refused to stay hidden. Her throat burned, but she swallowed the pain like she always did. For years, she'd taught herself that silence was safer than speaking. But tonight, something inside her felt different. Something inside her whispered no more. From the far end of the small diner, someone watched quietly. A man in a simple gray jacket, the kind you'd never look twice at. He stirred his coffee slowly, eyes following the scene with growing heaviness. He'd seen cruelty before, but there was something about this woman. Her quiet endurance, the way she stood back up even as her world crumbled, that made his chest tighten. Outside, the storm roared louder and the neon sign above flickered like it might give out any second. Inside, time seemed to hold its breath. The man's gaze softened, but his jaw clenched. He didn't know her story yet, but he knew one thing for sure. No one should have to beg for dignity. If your heart already feels heavy for her, you're not alone. Tell me in the comments, have you ever seen someone stay strong when the world tried to break them? Sometimes those moments change everything. Every morning before the sun had even started to rise, she would slip quietly out of her tiny apartment, careful not to wake her daughter. The city still slept while she walked the long road to the bus stop, her worn sneakers splashing through shallow puddles left by the night's rain. Her uniform was neatly pressed, though its color had faded from years of washing. Her name tag, Grace, had a crack through the middle, but she wore it proudly. At 36, Grace had learned that survival wasn't about big victories. It was about small ones. Making rent by the last day, keeping the lights on another week, finding enough time to help her daughter with homework before collapsing into bed. She worked double shifts at the diner and cleaned offices on weekends, her life a cycle of exhaustion wrapped in quiet determination. She wasn't bitter, not really. Life had just taught her to stop expecting miracles. After her husband disappeared 3 years ago, leaving behind nothing but a pile of debts and broken promises, Grace had promised herself one thing: I'll never depend on anyone again. But even as she whispered those words, loneliness clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. At the diner, customers came and went, truckers, travelers, and locals who barely noticed her. But Grace noticed everything: the tired eyes of a man counting coins for coffee, the smile of the old woman who always ordered pie but never finished it. She carried everyone's stories, even if no one ever asked for hers. The only person who truly saw her was her daughter, Lily, 8 years old and endlessly curious. She would wait by the window every night for her mother's return, waving through the glass as if her smile alone could erase the fatigue from Grace's face. "One day, Mama," she'd say, "I'll buy you a big house so you never have to work so hard." And Grace would laugh softly, hugging her tight, hiding the ache that came with knowing how impossible that dream seemed. Still, she never stopped trying. Each paycheck was divided with military precision: rent, food, school supplies, bus fare. Her hands were always dry from soap and disinfectant, her back stiff from standing too long, but her heart still held warmth. She believed kindness mattered even if it didn't pay the bills. And though the world passed her by without seeing her, someone had begun to notice: the man with the quiet eyes who sat in the corner booth every Thursday evening, always watching, always listening. If this glimpse into Grace's life touched your heart, hit the like button and tell me in the comments what's something kind someone did for you when you needed it most. You never know whose story your kindness could change. He always came in at the same time, 7:30 sharp, just as the dinner crowd began to thin out. A plain gray jacket, the same black coffee, and a quiet nod when Grace brought it over. He never said much, never stayed too long. But there was something steady about him, something that made Grace feel for just a moment that the noise of the world could fade away. She'd started noticing little things. How he always left a tip that was just a bit too generous. How he seemed to study the room not out of boredom but out of awareness. Like someone used to reading people, their stories, their pain. The first few weeks she assumed he was just another kind stranger. But then she caught him looking at her one night, Not the way others did with pity or judgment, but with quiet recognition, as if he understood. His name, she later learned, was Daniel. At least that's what the credit card said. He spoke softly with a calm tone that carried both warmth and weight. "You always remember everyone's order," he said one night as she refilled his cup. She smiled, a little embarrassed. "It's part of the job." "No," he replied, shaking his head gently. "It's part of you." The words lingered long after he left. For the first time in a long while, someone had noticed something good in her. Something beyond the tired eyes and the worn apron. That night, as she walked home under the streetlights, she found herself smiling, an unfamiliar feeling that felt almost dangerous. But not everyone in the diner liked Daniel's presence. The regulars whispered. The manager frowned whenever he stayed too long. "He's been asking questions," the cook muttered. "About you?" Grace's heart skipped. Why would he do that? What could he possibly want from her? The next evening, Daniel was back. The same booth, the same calm eyes. When Grace approached, he asked quietly, "Do you believe people can change?" She hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Maybe," she said. "If they want to." Daniel smiled faintly. "Good, because sometimes people just need a reason." That night, long after he left, she couldn't sleep. There was something in his words that stirred the air around her quiet, fragile world. She didn't know it yet, but Daniel wasn't just a customer. He was here for a reason, one that would soon turn her entire life upside down. If you've ever met someone who appeared in your life when you least expected it, someone who made you see yourself differently, tell me in the comments. Maybe their timing wasn't coincidence at all. ChatGPT said, it was a Friday night, the kind of night when tempers ran short and patience wore thin. The diner was packed, the rain outside relentless. Grace moved between tables with practiced calm, balancing trays and fake smiles. But beneath the surface, something felt different tonight, like the air itself was waiting for something to snap. At the counter sat three men she didn't recognize, loud and already half drunk. Their laughter grew sharper with each beer, their comments more careless. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them called out, waving his empty glass. "You missed a spot when you cleaned my table." She forced a polite smile and walked over, reaching for the glass. "Sorry about that, sir." The man smirked. "Sir? That's cute. You think respect can fix ugly hands like those?" The others laughed. Grace froze, her fingers tightening around the tray. Her cheeks flushed red, but she kept her eyes down. "Please," she whispered, "I'm just doing my job." "Yeah?" Another one sneered. "Then do it right." He flicked a piece of crumpled napkin at her apron, and when she turned away, he added, "No wonder your husband left. Who'd want someone like you?" The words hit harder than she expected. The room spun for a second. Every memory, every night of crying silently beside her daughter, came flooding back like a storm she couldn't stop. For a moment, she wanted to disappear, but before she could move, the sound of a chair scraping across the floor cut through the noise. Daniel stood up, calm, controlled, but his eyes burned with quiet fire. He walked over, stopping just a few steps behind her. "That's enough," he said, voice low but commanding. The men turned, sizing him up with drunken arrogance. "Who are you?" One of them laughed. "Her bodyguard?" "No," Daniel said. "Just someone who's had enough of watching people like you break good people for fun." The diner fell silent. Even the cook peeked through the kitchen window. Grace's hands shook. She didn't want trouble. She'd had enough of that in her life. "Please, Daniel," she whispered, "don't." But it was too late. The tallest man stepped forward, puffing his chest. "You want to play hero, old man?" He spat. Daniel didn't move. "No," he said quietly. "I want you to walk away." The man laughed and reached for Daniel's shoulder, but before he could touch him, Daniel caught his wrist, firm but not violent, and spoke through clenched teeth. "Apologize now." Something in his voice and the authority, the conviction, made the man hesitate. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, with a muttered curse, the men tossed some bills on the counter and stormed out into the rain. Grace stood frozen, her heart pounding. The whole diner stared at them, but Daniel didn't care. He turned to her, his expression softening. "You shouldn't have to fight alone," he said gently. "Not anymore." And in that moment, something broke inside her, not from pain, but from relief. Years of holding herself together, pretending she was fine, pretending she didn't need anyone, all of it came undone. She blinked through tears, unable to speak, and Daniel just nodded like he understood every word she couldn't say. Outside, the rain kept falling. But inside, for the first time in a long time, Grace felt something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Safety. If you've ever wished someone would just stand up for you when no one else would, leave A in the comments. Because sometimes one act of courage can heal years of silence. The next morning, Grace arrived at the diner early, but something about the place felt different. The usual hum of the coffee machine, the soft buzz of the neon sign. Everything seemed quieter, like the night before had left a mark that wouldn't fade. People still whispered about what had happened, about the mysterious man who had stepped in when no one else dared. When Daniel walked in later that day, Grace felt her pulse quicken. She wanted to thank him, to tell him how much that moment meant. But as she approached his table, she noticed something she hadn't before, the faint scar along his jawline, the way his hand trembled slightly when he lifted his cup. He looked like someone who'd seen too much of the world's cruelty. "I never got to thank you," she said softly, "for last night." He smiled faintly. "You don't need to." "I didn't do it for thanks." "Then why?" she asked. He looked down, stirring his coffee, lost in thought for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Because I used to be one of them." Grace blinked, unsure she'd heard right. "One of them?" Daniel nodded slowly. "A man who thought power meant control, who hurt people without even realizing how deep the damage went, until someone stood up to me and didn't give up on me when I didn't deserve forgiveness." There was no pride in his voice, only truth. He sighed. "That was years ago. Since then, I've made it my purpose to find people the world overlooks, people like you, and remind them that they matter." Grace didn't know what to say. She had spent her entire life believing she was invisible, replaceable, small, and yet, here was someone who saw her strength when she couldn't see it herself. Daniel reached into his jacket and slid an envelope across the table. "I run a small foundation," he said quietly. "We help single parents rebuild their lives, training, housing, education. I've watched you for weeks, Grace. You work harder than anyone I've met. If you're willing, I'd like to help you start over." Her breath caught. I can't accept this," she stammered. "There are people who need it more." Daniel smiled. "That's exactly why you deserve it." Tears welled in her eyes. No one had ever offered her a way out, not out of pity but out of belief. She pressed her hand to her mouth, shaking her head as emotions she'd buried for years finally surfaced. "Why me?" she whispered. Daniel's voice softened. "Because you never stopped being kind, even when the world was cruel. That kind of strength, it changes people." In that moment, the walls she'd built around her heart began to crumble. Hope, something she'd long forgotten how to feel, flickered to life again. As Daniel stood to leave, he said quietly, "Sometimes, Grace, we're not being tested to show our weakness, but to prove our strength. If you've ever had someone believe in you when you couldn't believe in yourself, share this story with them, or tag them in the comments. You might remind them that their kindness changed more than they'll ever know." A year later, the little diner by the highway looked nothing like it once did. The flickering neon sign had been replaced with a bright new one that read, "Lily's Corner Cafe," painted in cheerful blue letters that glowed softly against the morning sun. The smell of fresh pastries filled the air, and the tables were lined with flowers, a simple touch that made every visitor smile. Behind the counter stood Grace, no longer in a faded uniform, but in a crisp apron embroidered with her name. Her hand still bore the signs of hard work, but there was something different in her face now, peace. The kind that comes not from luck, but from surviving storms and learning to build shelter afterward. Her daughter, Lily, darted between tables with a tray almost too big for her small hands. "Careful," Grace called out, laughing as the girl set down a plate of pancakes. "You'll scare the customers away with all that speed." Lily giggled. "But Mama, we've got so many orders." The cafe was full just like every morning. People didn't just come for the food anymore, they came for the warmth, the kindness, the feeling of being seen. Grace had made it a place where no one felt small, no one felt ignored. Every smile she shared was a silent promise, "I understand. You're safe here." Daniel stopped by once a week, always sitting at the same corner booth. He never stayed long, never needed thanks. But when Grace brought him his coffee, she always placed it down with quiet gratitude that words could never express. One morning she asked him softly, "Do you ever think people like us can truly move on from the past?" He smiled. "We don't move on from it, Grace, we grow around it. The scars stay, but they stop hurting when they start reminding us how far we've come." As she looked around, at her daughter's laughter, at the community that had become family, Grace finally understood. Every cruel word, every sleepless night, every tear she thought had broken her, had instead built her into someone unshakable. Someone who could take pain and turn it into purpose. Before closing one evening, Grace placed a small framed quote by the register, something Daniel had once said to her. "Sometimes kindness isn't a weakness. It's the strongest thing you can choose." And every customer who saw it smiled because in that cozy cafe, they could feel those words in every cup, every gesture, every heartbeat of the woman who'd once thought she was invisible. If this story made you believe in second chances, in the power of kindness to rewrite lives, share it with someone who needs hope today. And tell me in the comments, have you ever met someone who changed your life just by believing in you? Grace stood outside her cafe as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and rose. The chatter from inside faded into soft laughter, the sound of belonging, of peace she had once thought she'd never find. She leaned against the wooden railing, breathing in the scent of freshly brewed coffee and rain-soaked earth. For a long moment, she simply stood there watching people come and go, truck drivers, nurses, single mothers, elderly couples, all sharing something unspoken. In their eyes, she saw pieces of her own story. The struggles, the exhaustion, the quiet strength it took just to keep showing up. Daniel walked up beside her, his hands tucked in his coat pockets. "You built something beautiful here," he said softly. "Not just a cafe, but a place where people remember they matter." Grace smiled faintly. "I used to think kindness made you weak, that if you kept giving, people would only take more." He nodded. "That's what the world teaches us. But the truth is, kindness isn't about being soft. It's about being brave enough to care when others don't." The wind caught her hair as she looked out toward the horizon. "Funny," she whispered. "A year ago I was begging for respect from people who didn't see me. And now, I spend my days giving respect to everyone who walks through those doors." Daniel looked at her, not as a savior, not as a CEO, but as someone changed by her courage. "You didn't just survive, Grace, you transformed pain into purpose. That's something most people never learn." She turned toward him, eyes glistening. "Maybe that's the secret, isn't it? That when someone believes in you, you start believing in yourself again." He smiled, his voice barely above a whisper. "And when you start believing in yourself, the world believes with you." They stood there in silence, the cafe lights glowing behind them like a promise. Grace glanced at the hand-painted sign, Lily's Corner Cafe, and felt her heart swell with quiet pride. The same walls that once heard her tears now echoed with laughter and warmth. She whispered, "It only takes one person to choose kindness. One moment to change everything. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that one act of kindness can change a life, give this video a thumbs up. Tell me in the comments, who's that one person who believed in you when no one else did? And remember, you never know whose life your kindness might rewrite next. Sometimes all it takes is to see someone